Okay, so shalom everyone. We are on. Good afternoon. Welcome to our conference about the histories of Ibn Gabirol, religious interactions between Jews, Christians, and Muslims in 11th century al-Andalus. We have assembled this conference today as part of the 1,000-year anniversary for the birth of Solomon Ibn Gabirol, celebrated here at the Tel Aviv University throughout the year, organized by Dr. Ariel Zinter. And today we will focus on the socio-historical context in which Ibn Gabirol was active. We have assembled here today scholars from 3 different continents, both in person and via Zoom. So this is why I'm speaking partly to the camera, partly to the audience here. We will have six papers, 6 presentations organized in 2 panels. And then after a short break, we'll have a roundtable with 3 discussants, 2 of the presenters, and an additional new discussant. And we'll have time for question and answers, both at the end of each panel and, of course, at the roundtable. And without further ado, I invite 2 chairs of the schools that supported this conference to say a few words. So first, Professor Miriam Shefer-Mossensohn, the head of the school of the Yavetz School of Historical Studies at Tel Aviv. Professor Mossensohn, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Moshe. So good afternoon, good morning, everyone, depending on your time zone. I'm Miriam Shefer-Mossensohn. I'm the head of the Yavetz School of Historical Studies here at Tel Aviv, and it's really my pleasure to open this international conference on the histories, in the plural, of Ibn Gabirol. And as Moshe said, today's event is part of a series of workshops, conferences, and public engagements in our Faculty of Humanities, celebrating the 1000th anniversary of Ibn Gabirol. As historians, we should be extremely cautious in drawing lessons from past periods. Nevertheless, when we follow the horrendous events in Eastern Europe, the life of Ibn Gabirol and the whole of al-Andalus give us a glimmer of hope and optimism. Not because we think of Iberia at that time in nostalgic and idyllic terms, we won't follow into that trap, but the histories of Ibn Gabirol show us options of individual and communal existence and coexistence. And especially now, it's important to remember that there are possibilities for a worse reality, but also for a better one. So I want to thank the organizers for the initiatives and all the speakers for coming either in person or joining us in Zoom. And if I may, I'd like to specifically say hello to my undergraduate teacher, David Wasserstein. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Mossensohn. And now I invite Professor Youval Rotman, the chair of the School of Jewish Studies and Archeology, of Chaim Rosenberg School of Jewish Studies and Archeology, to say a few words. Thank you.
You see me? Yeah. Okay. Masal khair. Good evening. It's a pleasure. I join my colleague and friend Miri in welcoming you all to this event, and thank the organizers, of course. And it's a great pleasure to host it together with the School of History, the School of Jewish Studies and Archeology. I would like just to say a few words of the importance of Ibn Gabirol histories per se for Andalus and the Mediterranean world and Jewish, Muslim, Christian relationships. We'll hear about that in this evening. I would like to refer to something particularly personal in my personal work of the history of psychology, and to give the floor to the star of the evening, Ibn Gabirol himself, by quoting one of his poems. מה תפחדי נפשי ומה תגורי? שכני וגורי באשר תגורי. I apologize for the Hebrew. אם נחשבה תבל קטנה לך ככף, אנה ענייה סוערת הטורי. טוב מהלוך אנה, ואן כי תשבי, לפני אדונייך ולא תסורי. אם מאנוש תנזרי, תעזרי, ושכר פעולתך, אזי תשורי. אם תאוות נפשך כעיר מבצר, הלא תיפול בידך, אם מעט תצורי, אין לך בקרב האדמה נחלה. אורי לבקש אחריתך אורי. So in this poem we see the I, the personal, the poet speaking in a relationship, in a dialogue with his soul. And this resonates one of the earlier poem of Hadrian the Emperor, and I would just quote briefly in Latin, Animula vagula blandula, hospes comesque corporis, quainunque abibis in loca, aladilula rigida nudula, nec utsules dabis iocus. And in English translation, my soul, my pleasant and witty, the jest and consort of my body, into what place now all alone, naked and sad, will do be gone. No wit, no wit as heretofore. No jest will thou afford me more. And this is something that is related to the importance of poetry in the long history of psychology that actually begins in Qumran with Megillat HaOdayot, in which the narrator speaks to his soul and relates the soul, himself, and God. So I'm looking forward to this event very much, and thank you, the organizer, and all the participants who are joining us from afar. Good luck.
Thank you very much to Professor Rotman. And now it's 4:15, so it's time for our first panel, which is titled Centered on the Local, on Saragossa, Cordoba, and Lucena. And the chairperson of this first panel will be Professor Nurit Tsafrir from the Department of Middle Eastern and African History here at the Tel Aviv University. So I invite you, Nurit, to take your place here, present the first speaker and the panel as a whole.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm very happy to open this first session of the conference. On. I'm so used to it. It seems natural. Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. I'm happy to open this first session of the conference. We'll have 3 speakers, and we will have the 3 papers in a row and take the questions for all of them at the end. So each lecture is 20 to maximum 25 minutes. This will leave us enough time for questions and discussion at the end. The first speaker is Professor Camilla Adang. She is a professor of Islamic Studies at Tel Aviv University. Camilla studies Islamic thought in North Africa and al-Andalus, and also social and intellectual encounters between Muslims and Jews in the Middle Ages and the Ottoman period. She has concentrated on Ibn Hazm in particular, and is the author of Muslim writers on Judaism and the Hebrew Bible, from Ibn Rabban to Ibn Hazm. This was published in Leiden, 1996. And the second book with Sabina Schmidtke, Muslim Perceptions and Receptions of the Bible, Texts and Studies, published in Atlanta in 2019. Her recent and forthcoming publications analyze the fatwa collections of Al-Mazuni and Al-Wansharisi. Camilla will speak on Saragossa. The title is Who Was Who in Saragossa, please.
Thank you very much, Nurit. Thank you very much for the organizers for inviting me to this workshop. Who was who in Saragossa? One of the few undisputed facts in the biography of Solomon ibn Gabirol, Abu Ayyub Sulaiman bin Yahya in Arabic, is that he was born in the city of Malaga on the southern coast of al-Andalus, in or around the year 1021 of the Common Era. His family was originally from Cordoba, but probably decided to leave that city in the year 1013 when a bloody civil war, the Fitna, in the Umayyad capital, pitched different Muslim factions, the so-called Tawa'if, against each other, and during which many ordinary townspeople, as well as members of the political and intellectual elite, lost their lives. Ibn Gabirol's father, whose Hebrew name was Yehuda, but who was known in Arabic as Yahya, chose to move south to Malaga, where Solomon was born some years later. However, he was apparently still very young, though estimated ages vary, when the family left Malaga and headed for the ancient city of Saragossa, the Caesarea Augusta of Roman times, fleeing the chaos that reigned in the center and south of the Iberian Peninsula, where the Umayyad and Hamudid dynasties vied for power, or the semblance of it. Although it is not clear why Ibn Gabirol's father chose Saragossa rather than any other place, the main consideration may have been the relative quiet enjoyed by that region in the upper march. Saragossa, where Ibn Gabirol was to spend the larger part of his rather short life, was ruled consecutively by two Arab dynasties, the Tujibids between 1010 and 1039, and subsequently the Hudids, who were in power from 1039 until 1110, when Greater Saragossa was conquered by the North African Almoravids, who a mere 8 years later had to surrender to King Alfonso I of Aragon. The region of Saragossa had been inhabited by Muslims as early as the 8th century and had grown in importance during the Umayyad Emirate and subsequent Caliphate because of its strategic location in the frontier region, bordering on the Christian states of Castile, Navarra, Aragon, and Barcelona. After the Fitna, which signaled the impending collapse of the Umayyad Caliphate, many scholars and writers, Muslims and Jews alike, abandoned the Umayyad capital, once called the ornament of the world, and sought a safe haven and rewarding patronage elsewhere. Ample opportunities offered themselves for the courts of the newly created Taifa states, such as Seville, Toledo, and Badajoz, competed with each other in attracting the most excellent scholars, poets, and artisans. It has long been recognized that this competition between the self-styled rulers generated an unparalleled cultural efflorescence. Saragossa too benefited from this development and attracted numerous eminent scholars and writers, Muslim and Jews alike. In the limited time at my disposal, I shall only be able to mention a few of the most important or most interesting ones in order to illustrate the stimulating intellectual and literary environment in Saragossa, which was certainly a catalyst for Ibn Gabirol's creativity in the realms of philosophy and ethics, disciplines in which he produced major works in the language common to all Andalusi intellectuals, regardless of their religious affiliation, Arabic. Hebrew he reserved for his religious and secular poetry, as well as for his versified tract on grammar. Many of those who came to Saragossa were experts in sciences such as medicine, philosophy, pharmacology, or botany, disciplines that had started to be cultivated there under the aegis of Saragossa's semi-independent ruler, Mundir bin Yahya, and his successors, Yahya bin Mundir and Mundir II. The first Hudid rulers, who supplanted the Tujibids, shared their predecessors' interest in the empirical sciences and were even known to be scholars in their own right. This openness to what may be termed the secular sciences, as opposed to Islamic jurisprudence and theology, which I should add were not neglected either, turned Saragossa into one of the most brilliant Taifa courts. Among the famous men, we hear very little to nothing about women who made their home in Saragossa. We may mention the fickle court poet Ibn Darraj al-Qastali, died in 1030, whose first patron was al-Mansur ibn Abi Amir, the de facto ruler of the Umayyad Caliphate after the demise of al-Hakam al-Mustansir, famous caliph. In the aftermath of al-Mansur's death, which occurred in 1002 and which was followed by a period marked by political instability, Ibn Darraj, rather than remaining in Cordoba, where the short-lived Umayyad caliph Sulaiman al-Musta'in refused to pay him for his laudatory verse, introduced himself at several provincial courts before moving on to Saragossa, where in 1018 he presented a lengthy ode to the then still governor, Mundir bin Yahya, confirming his legitimacy as an independent ruler. Another fresh arrival to Saragossa was Abu al-Mughira Abd al-Wahhab bin Ahmad, died in 1046, a nephew of the famous, or if you will, infamous, notorious legal scholar, theologian and polemicist Abu Muhammad ibn Hasan, author of Tawb al-Hamama, a treatise on the psychology of love, among many other works. The two relatives had both served one of the last ephemeral Umayyad caliphs, Abd al-Rahman al-Tsafrir, as viziers, despite their inexperience. When in 1024 the young caliph was killed weeks after ascending the throne, the two men, following a brief period of incarceration, each went their own way, and Abu al-Mughira, who was a talented poet and a brilliant epistolarian, offered his services to several of the party kings in the north of al-Andalus, one of them being the last of the Tujibid rulers of Saragossa. As a third example of an expat from Cordoba, I should like to briefly mention Abu Omar Atalamanki, died in 1036, about whose life and works we are particularly well informed thanks to the studies by Maribel Fierro. Born and raised in Talamanca near Madrid, Abu Omar studied in Cordoba, traveled to Egypt, the holy sites in the Hijaz, and back to al-Andalus via Qayrawan. In 1012, he left Cordoba and spent a number of years in Almeria and Murcia before settling in Saragossa, where he apparently lived between 1029 and 1034. It was during the period of the second Tujibid ruler, Yahya bin Mundir, that it became apparent that the religious establishment in Saragossa was rather less tolerant than the ruling class. Atalamanki was accused of holding a number of views that deviated from the accepted Sunni norm. After the accusations had been dismissed, Atalamanki, who was actually known for his opposition to any reprehensible innovation, bid'ah, left Saragossa for good. Like many other learned men in his days, Atalamanki was of an ascetic disposition and had moderate mystical tendencies, a kind of spirituality that must have appealed to many of his numerous disciples in Saragossa and elsewhere. Many more examples could be adduced of Muslim scholars who found their way to Saragossa, where they hoped to find a congenial atmosphere to produce and teach their works and/or to find a lucrative position, and who each in his own way enriched the intellectual, spiritual, or literary life in this major city-state. Yet not nearly all of the men whose biographies are included in dictionaries like the ones by al-Khushani, Ibn al-Faradi, al-Humaydi, and Ibn Bashkwal, to mention but the ones chronologically closest to Ibn Gabirol's time, were imports. These prosopographical works, which are invaluable for the study of any aspect of Muslim society in al-Andalus, contain many entries on scholars who were born in the city and acted there in some official capacity, such as Qadi, jurisconsult, police prefect, or prayer leader, or who taught the variant readings of the Quran or prophetic traditions. Some of them are described as ascetics who refrained from contact with the outside world, while others are reported to have traveled abroad and studied with well-known scholars, most of them, like themselves, belonging to the Maliki school of law, which had enjoyed near official status in al-Andalus for centuries. The biographical dictionaries provide relatively little information on practitioners of the secular sciences. Unfortunately, Jewish scholars did not develop a similar biographical genre, which would have allowed us to provide a more rounded picture of Jewish life in al-Andalus in general and Saragossa in particular. Interestingly enough, it is a small work by a Muslim author, Qadi Sa'id bin Ahmad of Toledo, best known as Sa'id al-Andalusi, who died in 1070, that provides precious information about Muslims as well as Jewish scientists in Saragossa, including Ibn Gabirol. Of him, Said says that he was devoted to the study of logic, had a penetrating mind, and was very intelligent. And I should like to refer you to the translation of this text by David Wasserstein in an article from 97. Said adds that Ibn Gabirol was past the age of 30 at his death, which occurred close to the year 450, 1058. Other Saragossan Jewish scholars he mentions are Menachem ben Fawel, a practicing physician and a student of logic and other branches of philosophy, and Marwan ibn Janah. This man, who was raised in the city of Lucena, about which we will hear more presently, wrote extensively about grammar, lexicography, and pharmacology, and practiced medicine in Saragossa. Saad does not seem to have met any of them. The only Jew, or possibly former Jew, whom he refers to as being a personal acquaintance, is Abul Fadl Khazdai, scion of a learned family whose members are described in a recent article by Sarastwunza. Not only is he given a relatively long entry in the section on the sciences as practiced among the Jews, but he is also mentioned as Said's informant on another interesting Cordoban emigre to Saragossa, the Muslim mathematician and physician Abul Hakam Amr bin Abdurrahman al-Kirmani, who died in 1066. During his travels in the East, this man had acquired a copy of the Rasail Ikhwan Safa, variously translated as the Epistles of the Pure Brethren or the Epistles of the Brethren of Purity, the enigmatic collection of some 50 epistles dealing with topics such as mathematics, philosophy, logic, language, ethics, theology, and magic, among many other topics. Said states that he does not know of anyone who had brought these letters to al-Andalus before him, though recent research has established that in fact the work had already been introduced by the middle of the 10th century. It was to have a profound influence on the development of philosophy and mysticism in al-Andalus, and Ibn Gabirol's own thought seems to have been greatly inspired by it. We do not know whether he had access to the full text or to extracts from it, though. Coming back now to Ibn Gabirol, it would seem that he lost both his parents not long after the move to Saragossa. We do not know how his father had provided for his family and how he himself made a living. In his poetry, he comes across as lonely, destitute, and isolated, possibly as a result of a disfiguring skin disease, which, paired with an unpleasant character, put most people off. Not so Yaqutiyel ben Hasan, a Jewish patron of the arts and sciences who held high office under the third Tujibid ruler Al-Mundir II. Apparently recognizing his talent and potential, Yaqutiyel ben Hasan took Ibn Gabirol under his wing, although the latter did not always reciprocate with gratitude. We do not know who Ibn Gabirol's teachers were and which books he studied, besides the Rasail Ikhwan Safa, with which he may have become familiar through Abul Hakam al-Kirmani. Although it is obvious that Ibn Gabirol did not produce his works in a vacuum, he himself does not mention any contacts with Muslim scholars, nor are there any Muslim authors who mention having been in personal contact with the Jewish poet-philosopher. Nor do we know about many Saragossan Jews that he was in contact with, apart from Ibn Janah and one or two others. However, it seems reasonable to assume that Yaqutiyel bin Hasan, his patron, saw to it that he received a thorough education in Arabic and Hebrew letters and prose, poetry and prose, as well as in ethics, logic, and philosophy. In 1039, a revolt broke out, which put an end to the rule of the Tujibid dynasty and marked the beginning of a new period in the history of Saragossa, that of the Banu Hud, who up to that point had ruled in nearby Lerida. One of the victims of the revolt was Yaqutiyel bin Hasan, who was executed. In need of a new patron, the young Ibn Gabirol looked to Granada, where the most famous of Jewish courtiers, Samuel ibn Naghrila, also known here, of course, as Shmuel Hanagid, had risen to a position of great power under the Berber dynasty of the Zirids. Ibn Gabirol temporarily left Saragossa for Granada, where it is said he became the tutor of Joseph. Samuel's son and future successor. However, relations between the two men, both exceptionally gifted Hebrew poets and neither of them very modest, soon soured, so Ibn Gabirol returned north. It is possible that he went back to Granada a second time to make peace with his one-time benefactor, whose death in 1056 he lamented in a moving elegy. In or around the year 1045, Ibn Gabirol left Saragossa. Whether his departure was of his own volition or because he was cast out by his more conservative co-religionists is unclear. In a long poem, he complained bitterly about not being understood or accepted by mediocre people who failed to recognize his genius. I should like to read a few fragments from this poem in the translation of the brilliant Peter Cole. So I quote. These are just fragments from a quite long poem. How could you call me alive when you know of my distress? Is it nothing to live among people who can't tell their right hand from left? I'm buried, but not in a graveyard, in the coffin of my own home. I suffer with neither father nor mother, indigent, young and alone. On my own without even a brother, not a friend apart from my mind. I mix my blood with my tears and my tears into my wine. I'm treated here as a stranger, despised as though I were living with ostriches, caught between crooks and the fools who think their hearts have grown wise. One hands you venom to drink, another strokes you with his words and lies in wait in his heart, addressing you, please, my lord. People whose fathers were not fit to be dogs to my flock of sheep. Their faces have never known blushing unless they were painted with crimson cheeks. They're giants in their own eyes, grasshoppers here in mine. They quarrel with all my teachings and talk as though I were speaking Greek. Speak, they carp, as the people speak, and we'll know what you have to say. And now I'll break them like dirt or like straw, my tongue's pitchfork thrust into their hay. If your ears aren't able to hear me, what good could my harmonies do? Your necks aren't worthy of wearing my golden crescents and jewels. If these boors would only open their mouths to the rain that descends from my clouds, my essence would soon come through them with its cinnamon scent and myrrh. So again, this is only a fragment. There's much more in which he complains about the atmosphere in Saragossa. Ibn Gabirol moved to another petty state, apparently Valencia, where he died in 1058, although other later dates are given as well. If he was indeed born in 1021 or 1022, this would mean that he was only 37 years old when he died. Whether he fared any better in Valencia than in Saragossa is not known. Like so much else in the biography of this fascinating thinker, the millennium of whose birth this symposium is celebrating. Thank you.
Thank you, Camilla. The second speaker. I want to look at the speaker though. Also, okay. Why do I have to look at the speaker? Because I made sure ahead of time that I know how to pronounce her first name. Either it's Janina or Janina, but now I see that she writes it Nina. So I apologize in advance. I was told that your first name is Janina, is this correct?
You may call me Janina or Nina or Janina.
Great. So Janina Safran is an associate professor of medieval Islamic history at Penn State University. Her particular areas of research are al-Andalus and the Maghrib. She is the author of 2 monographs, the Second Umayyad Caliphate, Harvard, 2001, and Defining Boundaries in Al-Andalus, Cornell, 2013. In recent years, She has been investigating aspects of al-Andalusi Maghribi Maliki community and memory and Maliki legal interpretation between the year 1000 and 1500. She'll speak about Abu Asbagh ibn Sahl. I think it should be Abu Asbagh ibn Sahl, who is a contemporary of Ibn Gabirol, and the promotion of Islamic legal norms in 11th century al-Andalus and the far Maghrib. Please, I can stay here now.
Good morning, good afternoon. I'm going to screen share just to help you follow some of my discussion and to provide you with some maps. Can you see this slide?
Okay. Yes, we can see it. Yes,
all right, I'll begin. So this paper is about the larger political, social, and legal world Ibn Gabirol lived in. I will use the life and work of a Muslim contemporary, the jurist and judge Asbagh ibn Sahl, to frame a view of al-Andalus and the Maghrib in the 11th century, and suggest how Ibn Sahl's Ahkam al-Kubra reads as a legal text and a work of communal identity. One effect of the reconfigurations of political power in the 11th century was the dislocation and relocation of individuals and families. As Camilla outlined, Ibn Gabirol's family originated in Cordoba and emigrated to Malaga when the fitna or revolt that led to the collapse of Umayyad rule devastated the Umayyad capital in 1013. The family then migrated north from Malaga to Saragossa. Ibn Gabirol spent some time in the Taifa kingdom of Granada and may have died in Valencia. His contemporary, Ibn Sahl, was born in the region of Hasan in 1022, so it's also the millennium of his birth. And he too had a peripatetic life defined by professional interests and opportunities and by the disruptions and uncertainties associated with dramatic political change. He lost his position as ancillary to the judge of 3 districts of Hasan when the Emir of Almeria, who appointed him, died. He took up a position in Cordoba as an assistant to the magistrate and became a member of the Consultative Juridical Council. After 6 years, he moved to Toledo, where he served as assistant to that kingdom's judge until he was dismissed for unknown reasons after 7 years. He returned to Cordoba, then under the authority of the ruler of Seville, and briefly served as assistant to the judge until Cordoba fell briefly under the rule of Al-Ma'mun Dhu al-Nun, the Emir of Toledo, in 1075. Ibn Sahl crossed the Straits of Gibraltar and spent 2 years in Ceuta under the rule of the Bargawata Emir until the Almoravids conquered the city in 1083, whereupon he moved to Tangier and served as judge there and perhaps briefly to Meknes before he returned to al-Andalus in the summer of 1087. This time he traveled in the company of the Almoravid Emir Yusuf ibn Tashfin on his campaign to besiege Aledo in Murcia. During the failed siege, the Zirid Emir of Granada, Abdullah ibn Bulugin, invited Ibn Sahl to serve as Qadi of Granada. In 1090, the Zirid ruler sent Ibn Sahl to Ceuta as an envoy to Yusuf ibn Tashfin, who was concentrating troops in preparation for an attack on Granada, but Ibn Sahl joined the Almoravids, betraying the Zirids. He briefly served as Qadi of Granada under Almoravid rule before his death in 1093. Ibn Sahl was able and willing to relocate from city to city and kingdom to kingdom, and thus negotiate the vicissitudes of the Taifa era because he had an education suited to teaching, legal consultation, and the administration of justice. He also had a social network of teachers, peers, and students. Biographical sources don't mention his family or indicate anything about his personal life, but they do indicate some close bonds defined by scholarship and profession. While in Cordoba from 1052 to 1058, for example, Ibn Sahl studied with and became close to the jurist Ibn Attab. When he left Cordoba for Toledo, he traveled with another Cordoban jurist, Abu Zayd ibn al-Hassa, who had been newly appointed as judge of Toledo by the Emir al-Ma'mun Yahya Duwal-Nun. Ibn al-Hassa invited Ibn Sahl to serve as his assistant. Ibn Sahl's most enduring legacy as a scholar is a work he produced in Ceuta and added to later in life, the Ahkam al-Kubra. The work is a compilation of legal opinions that are quoted partially or in full, addressing legal cases that arose in Cordoba and elsewhere in al-Andalus. The compiled opinions cluster around two time periods. One cluster dates to the 10th century and includes opinions by jurists consulted by the Qadis Ahmed ibn Ziyad and Muhammad ibn Zarb. Ibn Sahl clearly had access to the archive of their opinions. The second cluster of opinions are contemporary with Ibn Sahl's time in Cordoba and include Ibn Sahl's own opinions and those of Muhammad ibn Attab and Ahmed ibn Muhammad ibn al-Qatan. Al-Ahkam al-Kubra's pedagogical function is most apparent in those places where Ibn Sahl appends commentary. Occasionally, he affirms, criticizes, or expands on specific opinions, particularly in instances where jurists who were consulted about a matter expressed differences of opinion. Often his commentary relates the legal issues of specific cases to relevant portions of foundational Maliki texts, often referred to as the mother texts. These mother texts date to the 9th century and embody the legal opinions of Malik ibn Anas, who lived in Medina in the 8th century, and those of his students. They are foundational to the Maliki madhab or legal tradition in al-Andalus and the Maghrib, and include Sakhnun's Mudawana and Ibn Habib's Wadiha. Given the context of the breakup of the Umayyad Caliphate, the multiplicity of competing Taifa kingdoms, and the rise of the Almoravids, and considering the impact of dislocation due to political upheaval and war among Muslim and Christian kingdoms, we might read Ibn Sahl's orientation of Al-Ahkam al-Kubra around legal opinions issued in Cordoba as an act of centering. I mean this in two ways. First, the text was instructive for geographically dispersed jurists and judges who strive to replicate the authority of the jurists and judges of Cordoba. Jurists in Cordoba itself in the post-Caliphal era, such as Ibn Attab and Ibn al-Qatan, followed by Ibn Rushd al-Jad and Ibn al-Hajj, among others, maintained the status of the city as a center of Maliki learning through the Taifa and Almoravid eras. The Ahkam records questions sent to Ibn Attab, for example, by judges elsewhere seeking consultation. The Almoravid era fatwa collections of Ibn Rushd and Ibn al-Hajj present similar examples of consultation. Second, the text is informed by and enacts the memory of Caliphal Cordoba and expresses continuity with the past. We can recognize a similar kind of centering on Cordoba in political iconography. The Almoravid rulers Yusuf ibn Tashfin and Ali ibn Yusuf embraced and endorsed the centralizing legal practices and symbolic patrimony of Cordoba. I'm now going to offer an example of the content of the Ahkam and the legal impact of the memory of Cordoba. You may have heard of the case of the Synagogue of Cordoba. Ibn Sahl presents the legal opinion offered in Ibn Ziyad's court following the confirmation that the Synagogue of Cordoba was a construction that post-dated the conquest of the city. The 8 jurists whose names are recorded with the opinion concur that the laws of Islam do not permit Ahl al-Dhimma, protected peoples, whether Jews or Christians, to build churches or synagogues in the cities of the Muslims where the Muslims reside. The synagogue must be destroyed. The consensus of opinion of 8 prominent Cordoban jurists calling for the destruction of the synagogue, as transmitted by the Ahkam, became a point of reference for other jurists. Some 500 years later, when making an argument for the destruction of the synagogue of Tamantit in the central Saharan oases of Tuat, the Tilimsani jurist al-Tanasi invoked the unanimous assertion of the jurists of Cordoba that the Ahl al-Dhimma, Jews and Christians, are prohibited from building houses of worship. The destruction of the Synagogue of Cordoba was not a legally binding precedent. The opinions and judgments Ibn Sahl recorded in al-Ahkam are non-binding opinions and exempla of legal practice. He made them legally relevant and useful by locating them in the sources and debates of the Maliki Madhab, or legal tradition. Al-Tanasi, in the late 15th century, did not base his opinion calling for the destruction of synagogues in the central Maghrib on that of the Cordoban jurists, but pointed to their opinion as confirmation of his interpretation of the defining legal sources of the Maliki Madhab and related commentary. His extended legal argument was written in part as a refutation of the opinion of the judge of Tamantit, al-Asnuni, who advanced his own argument against the destruction of the synagogue of Tamantit. If you're interested in a summary of the legal arguments regarding the synagogue of Tamantit and some of its historical context, John Hunwick has published a short book and a couple of articles on the subject that I've listed here on this slide. Let's return to Ibn Sahl's commentary. Ibn Sahl incorporates the Cordoban jurist's opinion into the Maliki Madhab by delineating what the defining Maliki sources have to say about the construction of dhimmi houses of worship. The 9th century texts he cites, following his redaction of the Cordoban's opinion, are Ibn Habib's Wadiha and Sahnun's Mudawana. Each text provides the 8th century legal opinions that inform the discourse about dhimmi houses of worship in the madhab. Ibn Habib cites Ibn al-Majishun and Sahnun cites Ibn al-Qasim, and both cite Malik. Ibn Habib records Ibn al-Majishun's opinions regarding dhimmi houses of worship in one of al-Wadiha's chapters on jihad, a text which is no longer extant. Sahnun addresses the subject of churches in the lands of Islam in his chapter on rents and hires. Ibn Sahl's commentary on the Cordoban jurist's opinion about the destruction of the city's synagogues begins with Ibn Habib's citation of Ibn al-Majishun's transmission of Malik's narration of a hadith. Quote, "The messenger of God said, Judaism and Christianity are not raised up among you." Ibn al-Majishun says on this basis that it is prohibited to build a church in Dar al-Islam, either in its sanctuaries or in its districts, unless the Ahl al-Dhimma live separately and there are no Muslims among them. In those circumstances, they are not prohibited from building houses of worship or from importing wine and raising swine. Where Ahl al-Dhimma do live among the Muslims, not only are they prohibited from building new houses of worship, but they're also prohibited from repairing the existing houses of worship, unless this was a provision of their treaty of surrender. If repairs were stipulated as a condition of their surrender, they may make repairs, but they may not expand existing structures. If the Ahl al-Dhimma made the right to build new churches a condition of their treaty with the ruler, and he agreed to the terms, then he did so out of ignorance. As Ibn al-Majishun expresses, it is more important to forbid new houses of worship in conformity with the Hadith than to uphold a stipulation in a treaty that allows new houses of worship agreed to by a ruler out of ignorance. There is no validity to a treaty, ahd, he affirms, that is made in disobedience to God. Ibn Sahl's redaction of Ibn Habib's redaction of Ibn al-Majishun's opinion continues, addressing the circumstances of people who came under Muslim rule not by treaty, but by force, who pay the jizya or poll tax of protected peoples as a consequence of their forced surrender. In his view, all the existing churches must be destroyed. They may not build new ones, even if they live isolated from the Muslim community. He explains that this is because they do not have an ahd, or treaty. He says they are like slaves of the Muslims. In exchange for the jizya, they are protected from bloodshed. Ibn Sahl next cites the Mudawana, where the discussion centers on a statement by Malik ibn Anas. Sakhnun cites Ibn al-Qasim, who cites Malik's statement, Christians do not make use of churches in the lands of Islam unless they have an order granting them this. Ibn al-Qasim elaborates on this statement. Dhimmis are not forbidden from making use of churches in the districts covered in their treaties because this is their land. They can sell the land and the houses if they like. In the circumstances where the people surrendered by force, they cannot build anything because they cannot sell or inherit the land or the houses because it is the property of the Muslim treasury. When they surrendered, they lost their land and their houses. Ibn Sahl reports, continuing to cite the Mudawana, another unattributed opinion that the Ahl al-Dhimma are not forbidden from churches in the districts or villages which they established in the lands of Islam after those regions were conquered by force, or from making use of churches in the lands of Islam if they settled there under the pact of their protection and according to what that pact permitted them to do. Ibn Sahl's commentary ends here. He does not express his own opinion. Let me note that Ibn Sahl's redaction of the Mudawana chapter addressing dhimmi houses of worship is redacted in such a way as to eliminate potentially distracting issues. For example, he cuts the framing discussion. The section of the Mudawana he quotes begins with a question about whether a Muslim may legally rent his house in one of the Muslim garrison cities to someone who will use it as a church or a fire temple. Or if he may rent out a house he owns in one of the dhimmi villages to be used as a church. The question conjures dhimmis moving into garrison cities and Muslims acquiring property in dhimmi settlements, social trends affirmed by other sources. By cutting out this original question and Ibn al-Qasim's reply, Ibn Sahl effectively disconnects Malik's statement, Christians do not make use of churches in the lands of Islam unless they have an order granting them this, from a social context in which Muslims sell and rent to dhimmis, and dhimmis are seeking to establish houses of worship. Ibn Sahl's redaction of the Mudawana also cuts out another of Ibn al-Qasim's quotations of Malik's opinions. Quote, they are forbidden from making use of a church in the lands of Islam unless they have an ahd, or treaty, and they carry their ahd with them. Ibn al-Qasim cites this opinion to support his view that dhimmis may acquire property in Muslim garrison cities founded during the conquest, because Muslims there are free to dispose of their property. If dhimmis move into the garrison cities, They carry their acht, their protection, with them, and presumably the right to make use of the church. Arguably, Ibn Sahl privileges Ibn al-Majishun's perspective by citing it prior to the opinions in the Mudawana. Ibn al-Majishun's position, as cited, is clear. No new churches in the lands that surrendered by treaty if the dhimmis live among the Muslims, and all houses of worship in the lands taken by force should be destroyed. According to this view, whether Cordoba was taken by force or by treaty, no synagogue may be built where dhimmis live among the Muslims. The relevant Mudawana text is not specifically about the construction of churches and is more ambiguous in its implications. To conclude, Ibn Sahl's Ahkam al-Kubra has a pedagogical function, promoting education about legal reasoning and judgments by relating jurists' situational opinions or fatwas to the foundational sources of the Maliki madhab. In doing so, he also gives the fatwas authority. They are grounded in the opinion of recognized Maliki authorities. The Cordoba-centeredness of the fatwas he selected is an outcome of the Umayyad capital's centrality to Maliki jurisprudence in the 9th and 10th centuries. I suggest that the Cordoba-centeredness also contributed to the reception of al-Ahkam, and that al-Ahkam helped promote Cordoba's continued relevance as a center of Maliki jurisprudence. My recapitulation of Ibn Sahl's commentary on the legal consensus to destroy the synagogue of Cordoba in the late 9th or early 10th century demonstrates how his work links 11th century Cordoba to the foundations of Maliki jurisprudence as a mode of explication and evaluation. In the process, we can see he affirms continuity with the past and evokes the shared history of the Muslim community. In addition to its pedagogical utility, Ibn Sahl's Ahkam, among other texts, expressed for Muslims stability, continuity, historical identity, community, and status. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nina, for this illuminating lecture and also for not exceeding the time limit. And we now turn to the third last paper of this session by David Wasserstein. David is a professor of Jewish and Islamic history at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. Islam in Spain is one of his many areas of specialty. He has written extensively on Jews in medieval Islam and on Islam in al-Andalus, notably the rise and fall of the party kings, politics, and society in Islamic Spain. 1002 to 1086, it was published in Princeton, 1985. He also authored The Caliphate in the West, an Islamic political institution in the Iberian Peninsula, Oxford, 1993. His most recent book is on modern Islam and is titled Black Banners of ISIS, The Roots of the New Caliphate, Yale, 2017. David will talk about, well, the title of his lecture is one word only, and it is Lucena. David, please.
Thank you very much indeed, Nurit, for that kind introduction. And thank you very much to everybody, for the organizers, for inviting me, and for your tolerance of an American time for this. It's very kind of you to do this for us. And thank you also to Miriam Shefer for her kind words about me at the beginning. It's nice to be remembered and to be back among friends. I would like to note, beginning with a note of regret, I noticed the other day that I had an invitation to a conference, I think it was, in memory of the late Peter van Koningsveld, who died last July. I hadn't known he had died, and it's a great disappointment to me, as I'm sure to many. that he is no longer with us. His contributions to particularly the subjects we're interested in here today are fundamental for our knowledge of some very important aspects of Jewish history in al-Andalus, and his loss is to be regretted on that score as on many others. My title today is Lucena, and you will have noticed on the wonderful map that Nina just showed us that Lucena does not appear. Lucena in many ways represents a paradox in medieval Jewish history, whether under the rule of Islam or that of Christianity. We hear about it a number of times, but we know almost nothing about it. It was a town with a Jewish population, yet we know nothing of what that meant in terms of non-Jews, especially Muslims. It was a major center of Jewish religious and intellectual activity, yet its luminaries and their work appear no more productive or significant than those elsewhere. Rosenberg, whom I think I saw here in his excellent new book on Sephardi and Andalusi exceptionalism, refers to Lucena only 4 times, always in passing and always in reference to local scholars. Above all, we know that it was in some sense a semi-independent or autonomous Jewish locality, yet we know nothing of what that means. And its disappearance in that role seems to set the seal on our ignorance, if only because of what we know of its end. That end seems shrouded in 2 stories, one about an Almoravid leader, the other about Ibn Rushd, Averroes, that seems designed to push Islamic rather than Jewish concerns. And lastly, we hear a good deal about make-believe Jewish polities in the Middle Ages. Eldad Hadani and David Hareuveni are their purveyors. In this case, however, where there may well have been a genuine Jewish polity, not only do we know virtually nothing about it, but we also hear no mourning for its passing, beyond its inclusion as a single, isolated, and not very clear entry in the list at the start of Abraham ibn Ezra's famous lament for the Jewish communities of al-Andalus and North Africa, destroyed by the Almohads. The facts about Lucena, or Lucena Judaica, are few and easily summarized. Apparently more or less unrecorded in pre-Islamic sources, the small town is situated in a lush and fertile region growing grapes and olives, only 70 kilometers, about 40 miles, from Cordoba, the capital of al-Andalus for over 2.5 centuries. Medieval Islamic geographers tell us that it was well fortified. At one point, the famous rebel Ibn Hassun engaged in battle near it, and near the Umayyad capital of Cordoba. So far, what we hear resembles what might be reported of any other small town in the Islamic world of the time. Beyond that, however, all is obscurity, or more accurately, puzzlement. Inside the town, behind those fortifications, we are told, still by those same Muslim writers, lived only Jews. Muslims of Lucena were banished to the area outside the defenses. Jewish sources tell us little, beyond mentioning a Lucena connection for several learned men of various sorts, as noted by Rosenberg. There is also a small documents from the early 11th century, now in the Geniza holdings of the Bodleian, but they tell us little of use here. The most interesting references are in Islamic Arabic texts. The first principal passage in the Muqtabis of Ibn Hayyan of the 11th century tells us that in the year 973, quote, the Jew al-Hajjaj ibn Mutawakkil was given authority, sujjila in Arabic, over the qasama of his people, the Jews of Lucena, unquote. Felipe Maillo suggests that this is an office dealing with inheritances. While he may be right, it seems more likely to me that we should understand here something more exalted than just a minor local clerkship. The second passage, written not long after the Muqtabis, but dealing with events in the latter part of the 11th century, occurs in the memoirs of Abdallah, the last Zirid king of Granada, deposed by the Almoravids at the end of that century. He tells us of a rebellion against his rule by the town, then under Zirid control. He refers to several Jewish officials there, Abu Rabi, interesting name, who had served Granadan rulers as a treasurer in earlier times. Abu Rabi's son, that son's father-in-law, Ibn Maimun. Once the rebellion was over, Abdallah decreed that there should no longer be any Zaim, or leader of the Lucenan Jewish, does this mean the entire Lucenan community, but that all the prominent men there should enjoy equality in leadership, minor leadership, thus ensuring that none had any real power. One isolated reference of this type would be merely interesting. It might be true, and it might be mistaken or erroneous in one way or another. Two such references, in good Oscar Wildean fashion, from two such different periods in the history of al-Andalus and from two independent and distinct writers, suggest that there may be something to them. There is a little more. First, in an anonymous 14th century chronicle, Al-Hulal al-Mawshiyah, we find a story of the Almoravid ruler, Yusuf ibn Tashufin, of whom we've just heard, visiting the peninsula and coming to Lucena not very long after the time of Abdallah az-Ziri. At the town, a Qadi produced a hadith in which the Jews agreed that if their prophet had not arrived by the year 500 of the Hijrah, they would convert to Islam. The emir arrived in the year 495, and as by that year the prophet had not yet arrived, the Jews of Lucena were called on to convert. Instead, they offered the time-honored practice of a large bribe to the ruler, and he left them in peace without making any further trouble. Much of the detail of this story is puzzling, and it has not yet been studied as much as I think it deserves. But it points to a Muslim impression of a strong Jewish connection with the town of Lucena. That impression is greatly increased by a second story, this time involving the well-known Muslim scholar Ibn Rushd. Towards the end of his life, he died in 1198, he is said to have been the victim of various accusations related to religion, so the significance of that may be overstated, and to have been exiled from his post in Cordoba for a time. The place of his exile was Lucena, and the reason for the choice of that place, we are told, was that his family, was said to have had Jewish antecedents. In other words, that he was a descendant of Jews. We hear of such rumors only in this connection, and there can be little doubt but that the story is an invention. Again, though, what is relevant here is not that strange episode in Islamic history, but that it points to a Muslim awareness or notion of a specifically Jewish character to the town of Lucena. One other feature of the Arabic sources seems to support the Jewish character of the town. The rich biographical literature of al-Andalus gives us immensely detailed information about places of origin, places of dwelling, places of inhabitants, and so on, for virtually everyone of note and plenty of no note at all in the 8 centuries of the existence of al-Andalus. I have never once come across a Muslim with a connection with the town. However we view things, and whatever our interpretation of the evidence, Lucena presents large questions that cannot, in the present state of our knowledge, be answered easily or at all. What I should like to offer here, perhaps on that account, is a survey of those questions, something that has not yet, I think, been proffered. This seems to me to be a basic precondition for any real study of Lucena, of the Jews. Such a survey leaves us the poorer for hard knowledge, I fear, but richer for knowing something of the boundaries of our ignorance. The first question, not as obvious as may at first be thought, concerns the reality of the political situation. Who, as they say in America, owned Lucena? Who ruled it as overlord? What was the nature of the relationship between whatever authority existed in the city and the ruler in Cordoba? How did that relationship evolve over time? And most particularly, how did it change with the fall of the Umayyads, the coming of the Taifas, and rule by the Zirids? Why do we hear nothing at all of Lucena in relation to the Banu Narila, Shmuel and Nagid? except for a fleeting reference to Azariah, the son of Yosef ibn Gabirol, who found refuge there with his mother after the massacre of the Jews of Granada in 1066. The significance of the Nakhila family in the affairs of Granada should surely have meant much more for Lucena and its Jews and for our information about it as a town belonging to Granada than the evidence allows. What was the meaning of the location of Lucena at such a close, but not over close distance from Cordoba? Did it exist as a Jewish home or center before Cordoba became the capital, following the arrival of the first local Umayyad in the middle of the 8th century? Or was it such from the moment of the Muslims' arrival there half a century earlier in 711? If the latter, we are bound to ask if there is some connection with what have been, I think rightly, regarded so far as legends, the stories of Jewish help extended to the Muslims as they proceeded with the conquest. If the town was indeed Jewish from such an early date, presumption of a link of that sort seems inescapable, with further consequences for our understanding of those legends. That set of formal issues leads us to another question that is impossible to answer. Where did the Jews of Lucena, like the Jews of the rest of al-Andalus, hail from? Were they there when the Muslims arrived? If so, what of their earlier history? How did that connect with the well-known persecutions to which the Jews in Visigothic Spain had been subject for well over a century by 711? Conversely, if they were not there in 711, where did they come from? And how and why was it that town where they ended up? Why, in other words, Lucena? And of course, if they were actually newcomers, what happened to the old-timers, non-Jews, in that city? Next, we need to ask about the economic basis of the state, or city, or town, or estate, or locality, whatever we label it. Agriculture was certainly at the heart of that. This was the Middle Ages, after all, and Lucena was by no means large. It doesn't appear on Nina's map, remember? But who were the farmers, the peasants, the movers and shakers of agricultural plows in the city, around the city? We surely do not see here a case of Jewish landowners living in the town and non-Jewish workers outside, avodah ivrit in reverse. Does this then mean that here alone in Western Islam, though not perhaps quite alone in early medieval Iberia, there were meaningful numbers of Jewish peasants? If not, from what did the Jews of the town make their livings? They cannot have been taking in each other's laundry, as they say, or all studying in the alleged yeshiva of the time. This in turn, given what we know about Muslims living outside the walls, means that we need to ask about the economic as well as the social and political, to say nothing of the legal, relationship between the local Jews and local Muslims. How, if at all, did this fit with the relations that we are acquainted with from the rulings and practices normalized and outlined for us in the Pact of Omar and the parallel, or nearly parallel, Andalusi version of that document known as the Pact of Tudmir? And that in its turn must make us wonder about the absolute and relative sizes in the town and in its surroundings of the Jewish population and the Muslim one. And of course, it goes without saying, for the period up to the 11th century, which means for the entire period of the historically meaningful existence of this place as a Jewish place, also of the Christian population. We cannot imagine the total at any period to have been very large. And that, for the urban world of medieval al-Andalus, thanks partly to Thomas Glick's work here, probably means something under, say, 10 or 15,000 souls at the outside. Tiny numbers. What does that mean? In this connection, parenthetically, I should add that it would be good to know something more of the results of archaeological excavations in the town. Those references to strong fortifications in our sources may mean something, and we might also hope to find some evidence of Jewish cemeteries. What I've said so far brings us further to what is in one sense the most crucial cluster of questions. First, what can we know or say about the linguistic situation in Lucena? If Jews in the Arabo-Islamic world, or what became the Arabo-Islamic world, gradually but not slowly became Arabicized in speech, does some sort of rule like that apply here? Surely Arabicization is linked in some causative manner with the character, linguistic and other, of the neighboring population. If conditions here were indeed, as our sources describe them, the link may well have been, should have been, very different from elsewhere. And obviously this ties up also with what I asked a moment ago about the origins of these Jews. Language, actually languages and language behavior more generally, leads us on to the most important question of all, culture. What of the culture of the Jews here, and how can we locate that in the history of Jewish culture in al-Andalus up to the end of the 11th century? Here we have some hard facts. We can identify a number of Jewish cultural figures in Lucena, or closely tied to it, at least a dozen or so, thanks to work not only of Rotman, but also of Judith Tarkaroma Boras and Angel Science. Numbers of themselves, of course, mean little here. Any number is bound to be small, and a dozen is small. There is probably some duplication in our information. Our knowledge is clearly imperfect and variously biased by the nature of our sources, and so on. But Lucena appears with those dozen names to be solidly neither at the top nor at the bottom in numerical terms. It is right there in the middle. Not as many identifiable Jewish men of letters as Barcelona or Toledo or Saragossa or even Seville, but not as low as a whole host of other small places. Is this what we might expect? Should we not expect more? Or should we see something relevant here in the location of the place, at least until the collapse of the early 11th century, near the capital with its large, well, was it so large, Jewish community in Cordoba? Let me turn to another aspect of those dozen names. Those names that we have represent philology, scholars of philology. There are two such. They represent four Talmudists, scholars of halakha, another four. There's overlapping here, of course. Philosophy, just one. These are all the sort of things we might expect. But then we find poetry, which is not something we might expect in a town full of religious scholars. And we find that among the 12 people that we have, 12, in other words, almost all of them, virtually all of them, occupy themselves with poetry too. What this suggests is that, like Cicero and others in ancient Rome, a Jewish writer in medieval Lucena might dash off some lines of poetry before breakfast. But that is what we should expect in some other mixed town, not in a town of such pronounced Jewish character. Serious, scholarly, religious work demands more time and resources, and we don't in fact see so much of that here, and that represents a further puzzle. But another question lurks here. There is less and less question now about the nature of the relationship between Jewish and Islamic Arabic cultures in the Middle Ages, not least since the work of the lamented Rina Drori of this university. It is clearer and clearer that Jewish cultural activity in all spheres was heavily influenced by Arabo-Islamic. So we are bound to ask in that context about the existence and nature of such influence in this particular case. If Lucena was dominated socially, politically, and economically by Jews, what does this say about the relationship between these two groups, Jews and Muslims, in linguistic and cultural terms? Above all, how did Jews in this town gain their acquaintance with, their knowledge of, their deep immersion in the culture of their Arabo-Muslim neighbors? And why then, too, did their Muslim neighbors never acquire anything of theirs? Again, is Cordoba, just 70 kilometers away, at least part of the answer? All of these are questions, and I have deliberately framed them that way, deliberately doing so in order also to refrain from trying to spell out answers to them. For some of them, we can adduce bits and pieces of material that aid in understanding, if not really in clarifying, the problems. In others, no answers are possible in the present state of our information. On the most important of these questions, however, we are unable to do more than speculate. Nearly 30 years ago now, writing about Jews and Judaism in the Mediterranean diaspora in the late Roman period, Martin Goodman pointed to the significance of the limitations of evidence, as he called it, on the way we interpret our sources and on the interpretations that result from that. No less than the imagination of the historian, the limitations of the evidence clearly can, perhaps should, inevitably do, affect and shape our understanding of the past. Longer ago, half a century ago now, J. Zuckerman propounded the idea of a Jewish Princeton in feudal France in the 8th and 9th centuries. Saint-Baron, who had Saint-Baron generously called the book an act of daring. Others were less generous, and the book sank almost immediately, virtually without trace. Zuckerman's thesis, Jewish Princeton in feudal France, was met with incredulity and rejection. Incredulity because it was so strikingly at odds just with the absence, except for the Khazars and some Jewish converts in the Arabian Peninsula, of Jewish independence and statehood between 70 and 1948, but with the totality of our knowledge of the character of Jewish status and experience, the overall history of the Jews during those nearly 2 millennia. Also, therefore, rejection, because it is so much in conflict with the facts themselves very well known of Jewish status and existence under Christian as also Islamic rule. To make it both believable and acceptable, clearly, a good deal more was needed by way of facts and of evidence. Here in Lucena, we find ourselves in a similar situation, with sparse evidence, few facts, and the reasonable likelihood of incredulity and rejection. If nothing else, Zuckerman's experience should give me pause, give us all pause, and indeed it does. Whatever the potential significance of what I seem to find myself arguing here, supported by these few droplets of evidence, it is all at odds with everything that we know, as I stress, everything that we know of the Jewish experience under Islam these past 14 centuries, that rejection seems both inevitable and right. What we have here doesn't add up either to what we might want or to what we might find believable, given what we know of the Jewish past in the Islamic world over these 14 centuries. It is like a jigsaw puzzle with almost all of the key pieces missing. The main difference here from Zuckerman, apart from the change from the Christian to the Islamic environment, is that Lucena constitutes a new and additional case. That it is in such a different context may appear to give it more weight, render it more acceptable, and leave us therefore with not one weak case, but two weak cases, each a little bit strengthened by the presence of the other. But even together, they remain frail, essentially because the evidence in each case is so sparse and so weak. Bertrand Russell was asked once what he would say if after he died, he arrived at the pearly gates and God demanded to know why he had not believed. After some reflection, he answered, "Sir, why did you not give me better evidence?" Without intending any disrespect to those who accept the existence of God or of a God sans preuve, I think those who scorn Zuckerman and those who doubt what the evidence seems to tell us about Lucena might fairly make a similar point. There may well, in other words, be something there, as the evidence we have suggests, in both cases, Lucena and Zakerman, southern France. And as it is indeed very easy to suggest, but we still need more and better evidence, I think, to make us believe. Thank you.
David, thank you very much for this stimulating lecture. And I open the panel for questions. How can we do it in this hybrid, half online? Let me just... No, but I need to see everybody, right? So in case there are people who are... Right, because to make sure that everybody... Okay, so we can take questions both from those who are here and from those who are connected online. I see everybody now, right? Well, everybody who opened his camera. And yes, please. Okay. Okay, good. אפשר לעשות מיוט, נכון? Okay. Okay, so far so good. Okay, so...
אוסמן? כן.
אני לא רואה.
יש לו יד כזו נורא.
Yes, yes, Rose, please.
Thank you. These were wonderful, wonderful papers to begin this conference. I thank the organizers and the speakers. They were just wonderfully rich, each of them, and they fit well together. My question is for David. In his inimitable way, he dropped the suggestion that the fabled Talmudic Academy at Lucena is alleged. And I would love to hear more about that. I know that you've read all of the very few Jewish sources that suggest or tell us that figures like Al-Fasi, Ibn Megash, and many, many others were there studying Talmud. But beyond that, I think you've suggested we maybe don't know anything more. So I'd love to hear more about the alleged part.
Yes, please, David.
You want me to answer now?
Yes, yes. We'll take a question, answer it, and then.
Okay. Thanks very much indeed, Ross, for that. That's. I think that question goes to the heart of the issue or the problem here. We simply don't know. As I think I said perhaps too often, there are limits to our knowledge and boundaries to our ignorance. And I fear that this may be just over the edge of one of those boundaries. It is clear, and you make it clear in your book just now, that's just come out, that there were Jews who were very learned in Lucena. There were Jews who were studying there. They were studying probably, presumably, here we stretch the boundaries, I think, in some sort of institutional context. I'm worried about that. And I'm worried about that, putting it that way, because we have a similar institutional context hinted at, and I think it's not much more than hinted at, for Cordoba. And the hint we get, the main hint that we get for Cordoba, of course, is in the story of the four captives in Sefer HaKabbalah of Ibn Daud, where we have this beautiful story of the rabbi sitting in the corner of the yeshiva, and somebody says something, and he points out that no, that would cause such and such. I've forgotten. Too many immersions, I think he says. And it's a very fine story and it works very well, but I have to wonder if what we're talking about there really is some kind of medieval Islamic equivalent of a yeshiva. Are we seeing something like what our great-grandparents in Eastern Europe, those of us who had such great-grandparents, are all supposed to have spent their lives in? I don't think so, and I rather doubt that the reality in Cordoba or Lucena can have been quite so such as to be so simplistically described, let me put it that way. I'm sure that there was learning in Lucena, learning both in the sense of knowledge and in the active sense of learning going on there with teachers and students. But I would hesitate to go beyond that to in the direction of formal institutions that can be described or listed. I don't know of any evidence for that. And it would be, I think, in terms of what I've been suggesting today, I think, I'm not sure I used the word alleged. If I did, then
You did. I mean, it caught my ear because it's so wonderful. And it's in keeping with you will always remind us that we must proceed with the ignorance of, do not believe all of our sources and be conscious of their limitations or their absence. So it caught my ear because I'm guilty of, as many others are, of simply repeating what's been said, that there was some sort of institution there where people came to study. Maybe not.
Oh, yeah, maybe not and maybe yes. I think that's the real point. I don't know of any evidence for there having been one, but the evidence, the little poor evidence that we have suggests maybe there was something. That's the fence I'm trying to sit on, I think. I don't think I dare get off it either way.
Thank you.
More questions here or?
I have a question.
Yes, please, Moshe.
So I'm not sure if everybody can hear me, but thank you very much for all the speakers. And the theme that was going on in all three lectures, I think, was location and dislocation. And
just let's make sure that those that are at home can hear you. Can you hear Moshe's question?
Yes.
Yes, go ahead.
So it occurred in I think all three presentations, or in David's presentation as a location without dislocation. But I wanted to ask you, Camilla, with this dislocation and migration of Ibn Gabirol in several towns, going in and back with his parents and as an adult, how come, you said it, you possibly didn't remark on it, I think, how come he doesn't mention any connection with any other Muslim scholar, and nobody also mentions him, so it's not only his choice?
That's a very interesting question, but a very difficult one to answer, I think, at least from my point of view. Yes, he moved several times. We don't even know how often he actually moved, because there are some doubts about a second visit to Granada. Did it happen, yes or no? It is quite striking indeed that he does not mention any names of them. I mean, especially in Saragossa, where he spent most of his life, he must have, we're talking about institutions, there must have been institutions there as well where he may have attended classes. He certainly had a very, how should I put it, a classical Hebrew and Jewish upbringing, and he was also well versed, of course, in Arabic literature. Where did he learn these things? Who from? It's very hard to actually put one's finger on it. And I'm not the greatest expert on Ibn Gabirol, of course. So greater experts than myself may actually point, this is definitely the influence of such and such a scholar or such and such a writer. But so far I haven't found it, but it is indeed interesting. But also his biographies, what we know of him is actually very sparse, to put it. We're not even sure. I mean, we're celebrating this year his millennium, But when was he actually born? Was it 1021? In which case we should have been doing this last year. Was it 1022? And when did he die? Various dates are given. So there are very few hard facts, and he doesn't actually supply them himself. So there's very little to go on, and that makes it, of course, very tricky to fill in all kinds of gaps where this is actually not the right thing to go back to.
But also the other writers who do not write about him, you expect.
Well, later, I mentioned that there's not a Jewish biographical tradition. Of course, there are later works like Ibn Ezra's, who does mention him, and who does supply certain dates or facts, but are they factual dates? We don't know. There's too many discrepancies also with regard to the date of his death. And if we maintain that he was born in 1021 or 22, but we get different dates for his death, that also means that he was either young when he died or middle-aged or not quite so young, in which case, if he wasn't quite so young, it's perhaps less surprising that he composed such a magnificent and quite voluminous oeuvre, poetical and prose. Yeah, so everyone's always going on about he was really young when he died, and when did he manage to write all this stuff? You know, apparently he started writing poetry when he was 16. Continued to write in his 20s and 30s, but you know, if he was really this young genius, he must have died young. So, thank you.
Thank you.
More questions?
Yeah, can I have, thank you very much to all three speakers. It was really wonderful. And I have a question to Camilla and then perhaps to all three speakers. So one question is about, you mentioned, Camilla, the possibility that Yekutiel saw to it that Ibn Gabirol would get his education under his wing, which is a very interesting thought. We're sort of very used to telling the story of their friendship and at a certain patronage, but I've never. So I'm wondering whether that suggestion. I mean, is there a precedent, or is there even a norm that patronage, perhaps even in Muslim society, that patronage of poets includes sort of bettering their education? So that's one question. And the second question is, I'm sorry, the second question is to David. And I'm just curious, you mentioned a dozen scholars that we know of, and I'm curious about two specific ones, and I'm sure you've given some thought to it. One is Yitzhak ben Levi ben Shaul, who, as far as we know, is the first Hebrew poet in al-Andalus to write a secular erotic poem. So how does that fit into the image of Lucena? The shattered image of the partial image of Lucena, and the other is Yitzhak ibn Giyat, who's very interesting because he does write poetry, but he also, as far as we know, wrote a commentary on Ecclesiastes, heavily influenced by the Rasail from the East. So that's an education he must have received somewhere. So even if you have any guesses as to how those two people fit into the image, that'd be great to hear.
Shall I go first, David? Okay. Well,
please.
Thank you. Thanks for your question. Of course, this is also largely speculation on my part. I was talking about, filling the gaps because there's so little to go on. And the speculation on my part is, okay, so he was very young when he came to Saragossa. His father seems to have died when he was still very young, even though we don't know how old he was. We don't know how old he was when he arrived in Saragossa. We don't know how old he was when his father died. But presumably, he was still quite young, which is what most sources, secondary sources, suggest. So again, we come back to the issue of the institutions. Yeah, what was there? We don't hear about anything. We don't know to what extent his father was able to give him a proper education, and if he was able to give him any kind of education, what did it consist of? So in the absence of any such information, and also in the absence of any information about any institutional framework in which he could have acquired his Hebrew and Arabic learning, I came to Yekutiel, and it may not be true at all, but and I don't know whether there are other precedents or other parallels for such a relationship, if this was the kind of relationship. But also in the absence of any hard information, I may be allowed to speculate as much as the others do.
David, please.
Thanks. Who was asking the question? The voice was familiar, but I couldn't see any picture of anybody speaking.
This was Oded Zinger.
No,
okay. I think it's an excellent question. I'm not sure there is an answer. I tend to agree with Camilla on this, up to a point. We are to a certain degree trying to, as she said, fill in gaps here. But there are interesting aspects to this. One of them, as has been mentioned, is Yekutiel ibn Hasan. I wonder a lot about this question of patronage. There are two kinds of patronage that are in evidence here, of course. One is the more traditional kind, illustrated by people like Hastai and people like Shumail Hanagid, who simply give patronage to people who are established or becoming established scholars and writers, poets, whatever. The other kind, unfortunately, is the kind that we're asking about here, in the case of Ibn Gabirol, where we are looking at patronage of people who are gifted youngsters who might one day turn into something. And that's, I think, something very different. I'm not sure I would go with Camilla on this and see Yekutiel as a patron in quite that sense. I would see him more as a patron in the more normal sense, partly because, as far as I know, or as far as I can tell at the moment at least, if it were the other way, this would be the only case of such a talented youngster being picked out by a person who just happens to be available as a convenient patron for the future. So I'm worried about that. As to the two examples, Ibn Masha'ul and Yitzhak ibn Giyad, I think these are very interesting examples which point up, in a way, something different that I'm not sure if I mentioned it, but I've written about it in the past, and that is it's more than deep immersion of Jews in Islamic culture. Jews are a kind of minority within a larger, they're an island within a larger sea. They're a minority within a larger population. Jews are Muslims. I mean, we're sitting here in the presence of Sarah Strumza, so it's difficult for me to put it in any other way than the way she put it. Jews are members of a Mediterranean culture, a Mediterranean world culture. That is the world of Islam. That culture is the culture of Islam, and Jews are a special case within that. I don't think I'm misrepresenting what Sarah has written and said very frequently to our benefit. So in that sense, the question is not how is it that Ibn Masha'ul could write an erotic poem, just as non-Jews might write erotic poems. It's not how is it that Ibn Giyad might have access to the Rasail Ikhwan al-Safar, but rather, how is it that we don't see more of such activity? These people are not exceptions. These two people are, in fact, they might be exceptional in other minor aspects of what they're doing, but these two specific aspects of what they are doing makes them utterly normal as representatives of Jews, of Jewry, as a part of the larger world of medieval Mediterranean Islam. So I don't see a problem there. The problem, in fact, is slightly different. And one can express it as slightly different or as dramatically different. And I think I wrote about this once when I was writing about Qasmuna, who probably was, I think certainly was, the daughter of Shmuel HaNagid. I asked there, how is it that she was able, a woman in particular, to acquire the learning she had of how to write poetry in a language that wasn't hers, namely Hebrew? We can debate the ideology of what I just said differently. But how was it that she learned Hebrew? How was it that she learned how to write Hebrew poetry? How was it that she learned what to say in Hebrew poetry when none of this was part of her real background? She had to be taught it, and she was taught it. And she was taught it as somebody whose first language was, it is certain, Arabic. And what kind of Arabic? Any Jew who is a cultural figure, a cultural producer in the Middle Ages, in the world of Islam, is a person who has got two educations. He, sometimes she, has got an education in the literature and in the world of classical Arabic Islam. And on top of that, in addition to that, together with that, an education in the religious and literary traditions of the Jews. And I stress religious. But the first one that must come, perhaps first is the wrong word there, but the primary one there must be that of Islam. So when we see Qasmuna, when we see Yitzhak ibn Giyad, when we see Ibn Masha'ul and others, we're seeing people who know Arabic and who know Arabic poetry and who know Arabic, sometimes Arabic philosophy and so on. And on top of that, onto that, they graft a knowledge no more artificial, no less genuine of the culture of their ancestors, and they produce what they produce, which is something which is a magical mixture of two great cultures. So the question then is, how do they acquire the education in both, not just in one?
Thank you, David. I see another hand, but I'm not sure if we have time. This is true. Yes. So sorry, but we have